all like to say a thank you to Helen, particularly for the wonderful work that you did for us back in 1983. I know that some of that's perhaps already been said, but just to emphasise that it did make a huge difference to our movement. It was a catalyst that really did get a lot of things started. It really led to that huge, wonderful Women's March that happened in May of 1983, and it was the catalyst for the formation of neighbourhood groups. I guess it just was a particular combination of circumstances, but we do really owe you, I think, a tribute for that achievement. When I was writing the book I wrote about the New Zealand peace movement and how we became nuclear free, I found a quote from Sister Helen Caldicott. She was a great campaigner against the death penalty, and she put it rather poetically. She said of Helen Caldicott that she breathed on the coals of my soul and blew me wide awake to the nuclear threat. And I think that's what Helen Caldicott did for us back in 1983. So, that's a great thing. Now, Helen was kind of asking, New Zealand showed so much potential. Where has it all gone? Why are we still back in this situation? We're welcoming a whole feast of militarism in the next week. We're welcoming not only warships from all these countries, but we're also hosting Lockheed Martin and Babcock and every other weapons manufacturer. And we ourselves, if you look into it deeply, there are numerous weapons industries in our own country, mostly high technology that goes to contribute to weapons. Perhaps not quite the same as actually making the weapon themselves, but it's, if you explore it closely, it's quite surprising how extensively we are involved in the manufacture of the weapons of war and death. And that's what this whole week is about, and that's why we're protesting. But to answer the question, what has happened since? Well, we were fortunate in some ways. We got out of ANZUS because by standing up to the United States and saying, no, we will not have your warships here if they are capable of bringing in nuclear weapons or they are nuclear powered, that brought the ire of the United States on it and ended the ANZUS alliance, which was a wonderful thing. And it also made us really think about the alliances and the ties that we had to the nuclear powers and the, Britain and France and all the rest of it, and to look even further than that, to look at colonisation in the Pacific, and to realise that the nuclear threat was closely linked to the colonial issue in the Pacific. And we weren't going to be really out of it unless we could have not just a nuclear-free Pacific, but a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. And I think that's a struggle that's very much ongoing. We haven't got there. We haven't got out of all alliances. We're still in the Five Eyes. And that's a really significant one. That's the one that means we spy on our Pacific neighbours. That's the one that means that we can contribute to targeting of nuclear weapons around the world. We have to get out of the Five Eyes. So we haven't done that yet. And we have to look more closely at our colonial role in the Pacific. The fact that we are still, supporting countries like Indonesia. Indonesia is here. One of its warships is coming this very week. And Indonesia is still colonial power in West Papua, which is something I'm strongly campaigning for. So, I just think we need to look a little bit beyond and to think about our role in the world. We made a good move back in the 1980s. We had all sorts of independent potential, but we didn't really complete the task. And maybe that's something that we need to really think about during this week when we're looking at this feast of militarism that's in front of us. Thank you.
Whether any of you three have seen a documentary called Shadow World.
No.
Right. It's about the arms industry and the connection between politicians and arms.
Yep.
And it was shown in the most recent film festival, and it's probably the most powerful documentary I've ever seen.
Well, the politicians in America almost all are bought and sold. Lockheed Martin gives them huge amounts of money for their campaigns, and so they're not independent at all. They're corporate prostitutes. And I guess key is. But see, the politicians respond to us because we're the ones that put them into office. And if we're passive, then they go along with the powers that be, the fossil fuel companies and the like. If we educate them, and we are their leaders and they are our representatives, so we need to go to their office once a week and educate them. educate ourselves and then educate them and say, if you don't do thus, thus and thus, we'll make sure you're not elected next time. Then they get frightened. When we had 80% of Americans supporting the end of the arms race, by God, I could go to Congress and get Tip O'Neill, who is chairing the House, off the House floor to come to his office and say, what can I do for you, doctor? And I said, Tip, I want you to play The Last Epidemic, which was about nuclear war that we created in Physicians for Social Responsibility, in every single office in the Congress. And he did. He did. Because we had the people behind us. Yeah. All right, so we all live on the Pacific, right? Every day since Fukushima melted down, 3 reactors melted down, about 400 tonnes of very, very radioactive water have been pouring into the Pacific every day. And it contains all sorts of isotopes because there are 3 molten globs of sort of lava-like radioactive elements, still stinking hot, radiologically and thermally hot. And the water from the mountains behind them washes down under the reactor around the cores, becoming more and more radioactive and going out into the Pacific Ocean. Well, you might say the solution to pollution by dilution is okay because the Pacific is a big body of water, but that's fallacious because radioactive elements reconcentrate by orders of magnitude, hundreds of times in the food chain. Algae, crustaceans, little fish, big fish, us. And we stand at the apex of the food chain. When you're eating a fish with cesium in it or strontium or whatever, you can't taste, smell or see radioactive elements. You don't know it's radioactive. And cesium is a potassium analogue, and all our cells are rich in potassium, but in particular, it concentrates in the thyroid, where it causes thyroid cancer, in the heart muscle. And there are a lot of kids around Chernobyl, or people having heart attacks and just dropping dead, because it concentrates in the cardiac muscle. It concentrates in the pancreas. So high incidence of diabetes around Chernobyl. We'll be seeing that in Fukushima too, and the like. And it takes 2 to 80 years to develop cancer once you've ingested radioactive material and it's gone to different organs in your body. And when the cancer develops, it doesn't say, I was made by some cesium-137 you ate in a piece of fish caught in the Pacific 20 years ago, right? And we usually can't cure cancers. So the Japanese government is lying to the people. They're only looking at thyroid cancer, but all cancers can be caused or are caused by radiation. And if you want to know about Chernobyl, there's a wonderful book put out by the New York Academy of Sciences called Chernobyl, about how many, over 1 million people have died now as a result of Chernobyl. Many in the Ukraine, and there are 15 reactors in the Ukraine still operating, and there's a war in the Ukraine. You can't have a war in a country where there are reactors, because one missile could cause a meltdown, like Chernobyl. And I don't eat European food because 40% of the whole European continent is radioactive. So you don't know what food is going to be radioactive, the olive oil from Spain or whatever, and what isn't. Fukushima, first there was a huge release of radiation which blew across the Pacific, and then for 2 days the wind changed and blew over the Japanese. The government knew where the plume was going, but they didn't tell the people because they didn't want to create, quotes, panic. And the people evacuated into the plume, and the very short-lived elements that live seconds or minutes are extremely radioactive and give out gamma radiation like very high-dose X-rays. And then they decay, and then the longer-lived isotopes concentrate in food. Huge amounts of areas of Japan are now very radioactive. There are parts of Tokyo, if you take dirt from the roof of the house or from vacuum dust in the apartments and you measure it, it's so radioactive it would be eligible to be put in a radioactive waste dump in America. So Tokyo is very radioactive, and Fukushima is very radioactive. They're trying to clean it up by sweeping up all this dirt and putting it in plastic bags. So they've got millions of plastic bags about that big scattered, sort of very tidy, because Japanese are very tidy, all around the country, mostly in Fukushima. They're selling Fukushima products now in England, in Japan, and in Tokyo. They grow lovely peaches and all sorts of stuff. If the rice is radioactive, they dilute it with non-radioactive rice. And then it reconcentrates in our bodies. So already 174 children have developed thyroid cancer who were under the age of 18 at the time of the accident, and the normal incidence in that population is 1 in a million. And that's the tip of the iceberg. Soon we'll be seeing leukemia, which has a five-year incubation period, and then solid cancers will start appearing 15 years later, as they did in Hiroshima. There's a huge cover-up. The Japanese government is lying about it, and they've just passed a law saying anyone who writes about it in the newspapers could be jailed for 10 years. 10 years. They want to open more reactors. It's an absolute catastrophe and will never, ever be cleaned up or fixed, ever. They send robots in and it's so radioactive the wires fry. The robots die. And no people can go near it. The Yakuza is bringing in thousands of men to run the thing. The Yakuza is the mafia in Japan, and they're bringing homeless people from the streets and schizophrenics and all sorts of people. They need 6,000 people every day to be doing what they do. They've got over 1,000 huge tanks tall as this room, full of incredibly radioactive water, but they're running out of room to build more tanks, so they'll probably just put the water in the Pacific. Yeah, it's depressing.
Is there any hope, you know?
No.
Any hope that anyone else knows?
No, there is no hope. I'm telling you the truth. There is no hope.
I think you can actually grow mushrooms.
The mushrooms concentrate radiation. Why do you want to grow mushrooms? Yeah, so what? No, but it doesn't break it down. It concentrates it and removes it from the soil. There are wild boars running around Germany, so radioactive they glow in the dark almost, because they eat the mushrooms and the truffles. Same in Fukushima in the exclusion zone. There's a wonderful scientist, the only one doing any decent work. He's an environmental evolutionary biologist who's looking at the birds and the insects in the exclusion zones of Chernobyl and Fukushima to his own detriment and his health. The male swallows, 40% of them are sterile. The birds have smaller than normal brains, which is prejudicial to their reproduction. They've got mutations, so they've got crooked wings and abnormal feathers and white spots and the like. They've got tumours, they've got cataracts, and we get cataracts from radiation. The incidence of cataracts is very high in the population in Belarus and the Ukraine. Oh, you're talking about the power plants still operating? Yes. Over 400? Yeah, well, you know, the industry likes, first of all, in America, the public pays for the construction of the reactors, for the insurance, the Price-Anderson Act and everything, and then the utilities get hold of the reactor and they make $1 million a day by selling electricity. And they're running them longer than they should. They should close at 30 years, but they're running them longer, which is terribly dangerous because the metal gets brittled from the radiation and can break. But they don't care about the waste. It's like doctors, you know, we do an operation and just leave all the waste for the nurses to clean up. So the waste has to be stored isolated from the ecosphere for 1 million years. There's nowhere in the world they've been able to work out what to do. Well, how can they? It's geological timeframes, it's earthquakes. I was in the earthquake. Ice ages, you name it. And they keep making more of the goddamn stuff. And it will induce over time, because it will leak and get into water systems and concentrate in food chains. So we will see epidemics of cancer, leukemia, particularly in children who are terribly radiosensitive, 10 to 20 times more than adults. Little girls, twice as sensitive as little boys. And genetic disease, because it causes mutations like cystic fibrosis, my specialty. There are over 2,600 genetic diseases, all which will increase in frequency. and gross congenital abnormalities. There are hundreds of homes around Chernobyl full of the most grossly deformed children you've ever seen, because plutonium crosses the placenta because it's an iron analogue, and it's a very potent alpha emitter, and it can kill a cell that's going to form the right arm or the left part of the brain, like thalidomide did. Remember, women took thalidomide for morning sickness and their babies were born. I mean, I had a man who had a bobcat, and he used to come to my house at Byron Bay. He had no arms, and he ran a radio station with his toes. Well, those are the sort of deformities, plus gross mental retardation that we're seeing. That's a really great question, and it's really referred to everybody in this room. So when you start your new movement for peace in New Zealand, you must include what she just said about the Indigenous peoples in the Pacific, and you're absolutely right. And there's a big literature and there are a lot of articles about this going on. The Marshall Islands took America to the World Court and demanded that they get rid of their nuclear weapons. They were so brave, and it was beaten down by one tiny little sort of sentence in the judgment. But I totally support that. Whatever I can do, I will help you. I mean, what I read about these islands that in the Pacific, and they're just destroying them for missile bases and for Christ knows what. We've got to publicise that, and I think it should become part of the whole New Zealand peace movement. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what we do to our Aborigines is just worse than I can say. Yeah.
Perhaps I could just add a wee point. Yeah, I'd just like to add really that I can't go back to my theme of West Papua, under military occupation by Indonesia since the 1960s, suffering huge, terrible loss of life, and the Indigenous people just don't get a voice. But lately there's been a huge upsurge of solidarity with West Papua, and it's coming from the Pacific. It's coming from Pacifica and Maori people in this country, and it's coming from Pacific Island countries who've stood up in the United Nations for West Papua. No Western nation seems to dare to do that, but seven nations, 7 small Pacific nations did that. So I think, that to me is like the beginning of what we had back in the 80s with the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement. It's happening again, that cross-solidarity amongst those Pacific nations. They may be small, but they're very determined. They face lots of threats, not least of which, of course, is climate change. And they're standing up. And people here in this country are standing behind them and with them, and it's really exciting. People like me can stand on the sidelines and just cheer them on.
I'm reminded of being in Fiji several months ago, and I got this invitation out of the blue. I couldn't understand why I was invited to go, and it was a meeting of a range of Pacific scholars, overwhelmingly Pacific peoples, and this apparently scientific group from the European Union. Well, you know straight away that the European Union's interested because of the gold off Papua New Guinea and the uranium off Nauru and the magnesium and the Cook Islands, and they're not here for the good of anybody's health. And for 48 hours, it was like watching. I didn't say a word, really. It was like watching people talking past each other. And in the final plenary, the scientists were up the top, and there was a new Tongan Minister of Science who was urging everybody to have this great Pacific scientific agenda. And the European scientists were complaining because they felt like Pacific peoples knew a lot about the Pacific, surprising. But they didn't seem to want to share or divulge what was there. And it sort of came to this impasse. And it was one of those times when you think, oh, All right. I'll be the pālangi who tries to get these white blokes to understand what might be the problem. So I told them a story about when we were having all the tests at Mururoa, and the French scientists were saying all the time, oh, no problem. You know, we're measuring the sea, the fallout, and the stats are all coming in and it's fine. And I said, so the women of the area, when the fish were caught, they would hang the fish on a line, like with pegs. And they knew that the only fish that were safe were the ones the flies did land on.
Ah,
And there's a great deal of Indigenous knowledge in our world. And for me, one of the most important parts of all of our politics is to be led by it. Our people, our tangata whenua, our Pacific peoples have all been here longer.
What are we going to be doing this week,
yeah,
this month,
yeah.